Hi, everyone. My name is Lisa. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm one of the co-directors of the Notebooks Collective. Founded in 2021, we are a virtual literary arts space focused on community, connection, and continued learning. Our next In Conversation will be April 22nd at 7:30 p.m. with poets Fleta Brown and Anne Marie Oman, and a class with poet Pauletta Hansel titled Dear Friend, an epistolary poetry class will be on April 8th. Registration is open for both. Please check our website at thenotebookscollective.com to see all the details as well as information about events later this spring. The Notebooks Collective believes that Black Lives Matter and acknowledges that as a virtual organization, our offices are on the lands of the Kickapoo, Nipmunk, Agawam, Massachusetts, and Pawtucket tribes. Native peoples across the world continue to preserve and celebrate their cultures, and we encourage you to support Native writers and artists. As we do this land acknowledgement, we also want to recognize those who are suffering from conquest and terror in Gaza, Ukraine, and elsewhere. Our thoughts are with them. We know these are extremely stressful times for everyone, and we are so glad that you have joined us here tonight to celebrate community. I now want to welcome Rebecca to introduce our speakers.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rebecca, and pronouns she, her. And as you can see, I'm the other half of the team at the Notebooks Collective. One of my favorite things about hosting these events is that the guest shapes the event by who they choose to be in conversation with. So Cynthia asked Sarah, and because of her choice, we get to tap into years of friendship and camaraderie. Cynthia and Sarah met 20 years ago in London and have worked on and off over the years together. And now, in 2025, we have two book length projects from these poets that delve into their histories of anxiety and OCD. In Cynthia's tight prose poems, one can feel the confinement of rigid thinking and the panic in the syntax, how the speaker's journey begins in childhood and carries her forward to when she is a mother herself. In Sarah's narrative, in verse, she explores the facets of self, the fractured state of womanhood, and in doing so, allows the reader to enter at a place that feels right. When I think about how many lives I have lived in the last 20 years, cities I've been in, jobs I've had, friends I've made and lost, I appreciate the depth of these poets living. And so, how right it is to have them together to support each other in this conversation about these very personal books. And now I will do their bios. Cynthia Marie Hoffman is the author of 4 books, most recently the OCD memoir and prose poems, Exploding Head. Her 3 previous collections of poetry, all published by Persea Books, are based on travel, historical research on birth and medicine, and family genealogy. Essays have appeared in Time, The Sun, and LitHub. Poems have appeared in Electric Literature, The Believer, and the Los Angeles Review. The recipient of fellowships from the Wisconsin Institute of Creative Writing, Civitalia Raniera Foundation, and the Wisconsin Arts Board, Cynthia lives in Madison, Wisconsin. Sarah Kain Gutowski, she, her, is the author of 2 books, The Familiar and Fabulous Beast poems, winner of the 14th Annual National Indies Excellent Award for Poetry. With interdisciplinary artist Meredith Starr, she is the co-creator of Every Second Feels Like Theft, a conversation in cyanotypes and poetry. And It's All Too Much, a limited edition audio project. Her poems have appeared in the Threepenny Review, Painted Bride Quarterly, and the Southern Review, and her essays in Write or Die magazine and The Revisionists. A member of the National Book Critics Circle, her criticism has been published by Colorado Review, Calyx, a journal of art and literature by women, and the New York Journal of Books. Please help me welcome Cynthia and Sarah.
Thank you so much, Rebecca and Lisa, for having us both here tonight. I was so honored to be invited, and I'm honored to invite Sarah Kain Gutowski to spend this evening with me. We have a fun evening planned tonight. We're going to talk about process, read some poems, read a little from essays, and share with you some of our experiences over the past year that we spent together doing events and readings and panel presentations and traveling and having lots of fun. So we're going to kick off the evening by each of us going through a little overview of how we view our creative process before we dive into reading our poems. Something that Sarah and I really connect on is how we think about crafting the book. So we'll each kind of go through that, and then we'll read some from our most recent collections. So for me, my creative process, I would say, is really heavily focused on my concept of the project or the poetic series. I like to think in projects in the sense that I'm always writing more than one poem at a time. I really love the idea of a book, even more than I love the idea of a poem. So I'm always thinking about collecting work toward a book rather than thinking about inspiration in the sense of day to day, what inspires me today or what gives me an idea tomorrow. And a lot of that can be very freeing. I feel like I'm almost like a novelist writing my poetry collections because I get pretty obsessive about an idea and can write on a single focused idea for a number of years. Um, and I think that that's almost more the way a novelist works, where you get to know characters, you get to know your subject matter, and each time you return to the desk, you feel like you're returning to a welcome space or a world that you've created. So I'm not so much creating a brand new world every time I'm writing a poem. I'm diving back into the world that I'm building over the course of building a book. So each of my four poetry collections that have been published so far are what I would call project books. I don't think we use that term as much anymore. It has some negative connotations. But for a while, project books were really popular and everyone was talking about them. And that only means that you're thinking about the collection of poetry as a collective whole. So my first collection, Sightseer, is a collection of poems about travel. My second collection, Paper Doll Fetus, is about research, midwifery, and birth through history. My third collection, Call Me When You Want to Talk About the Tombstones, is a number of years I spent with my mother researching our own family genealogy and traveling together. And then my most recent collection, which I'll read a little bit from tonight, is an obsessive compulsive disorder memoir in prose poems. And Sarah, I'd love to hear about your collections, your process, how your process feeds into your concept of book building from a poetry standpoint.
It's very similar in that I get kind of obsessed with one idea and revisit that idea through lots of different kinds of poems. Um, my first book, though, was divided into three parts, and they were focused on fable, fairy tale, and myth. And so I got the fable part was really like one story. Then the fairy tale was a fairy tale. I went through the morphology of a fairy tale and I tried to kind of write it was like ridiculously ambitious. I'm not really sure about if I would go that way again. They were really long poems. They were written in Spenserian stanzas. I don't know why I tried to torture myself that way. I was like learning meter at the same time that I was writing those poems. And I think like that's kind of my approach into um writing is that like I'm a big dork and I really like learning like and so my way into writing is through reading. Like anytime I finish a project, I go through a big space of just taking in and like reading lots of different kinds of things, whether it's I'm going to read collections of poetry, but I'm also reading like craft essays on poetry. I'm reading like lectures. I'm reading uh fiction, I do tend to like more literary fiction. But sometimes I like to read just like a fun, fast comic kind of read. But I do find that like the giving myself some kind of challenge usually helps. And the project book can do that where you're like, okay, so here's this an aim that I have, and that helps me that helps spur creativity. Like my brain gets turned on by that problem solving that occurs. Um, and then but I'm at a so that's the way the first two books have happened, where the second book was like all one complete narrative. Um, and it focuses on fictional characters too. Like they are the extraordinary self and the ordinary self are like battling each other, and they're parts of me, but they're not me. They're like these separate entities. And then there's like this third voice that is supposed to represent me, but that's also like a little bit of a fiction, right? She's at a distance and a remove, looking at these two like insane parts of herself that are fighting for dominance. And um so I guess like I'm kind of wondering if that's the way I will always write though. Like I'm pretty sure I will always write by reading first because I just noticed that pattern in my lifetime. But I don't know if I'll always do like a project or a big narrative, but so far that's what's worked.
So do you think you write by reading first, primarily by finding inspiration in other poets' work? Or is it the research and the external language that comes from, diction and rhetoric outside the world of poetry that inspires you and feeds your poems?
I think my brain is resting in a different, like the poetry part of my brain is resting. The other part is active. And because I don't know as though like I don't my some of my favorite poets I don't sound anything like, you know? So if I'm talking about like them inspiring me, like I love so many poets who write lyric poems and I write largely narrative poems. So that's really strange to me. I was thinking about that the other day where like people were talking about people whose poems and I'm like like I love like a really kind of sparse something that's really using the white parts of the page, like not overly wordy. And my poetry is overly wordy and like long form. And so it's a weird thing to. So I mean, they do inspire me, but like they don't necessarily. That doesn't. I don't know how much it shows up in my work,
Mhm.
because I write very differently than the people I admire. Um, yeah,
Yeah,
I
I
don't know
think
if it helps.
inspiration is definitely a really interesting question insofar as what gets you excited to write your own work, but then also influence, like not only what you see in your own work reflected, but also what readers might see. And I remember my first year of my MFA, I came in and started sharing work, and other students and my professor were saying, "Oh, you write like, XYZ person." And I'm like, who's that? I need to write that down and I need to read her. If I write so much like her, they thought, oh, you must love her. So it's really interesting how influence comes in. And I liked also what you said about in terms of loving reading first and kind of being a dork. Well, that's what inspires me, I think, is that dork side of reading where I'm researching and I'm looking for information from outside the world of poetry. And I'm primarily my previous books, the three prior to the most recent, have all been very much reaching outside my own personal experience and thinking about writing from research, writing from others' experience, writing about things that I had read in history. And so for the structure of Exploding Head, I was thinking more about making a departure from that exterior view and really looking inside myself to write a memoir about my OCD, my experience of obsessive compulsive disorder. And it was very hard for me to turn off that reading first form of inspiration to get me into the writing, where I really had to think, in order to make this a stripped down memoir of only myself, not including research from OCD, history, which all of those things really thrill me and get me excited about writing. It was really a challenge for me this time to think about structuring a memoir about my own life. Um, so I'm going to read a few poems from Exploding Head, and then we'll circle back and have Sarah talk a little bit more about the structure of her book and read some from the familiar. So here's my collection, Exploding Head. And I'm just gonna, it's all prose poems before I start reading. So my camera didn't like that, but it's all prose poems. So they just look like blocks of text on the page, not lineated. My previous, two of my previous books were lineated, but I'm really going to start with The Face Has Seven Holes. This is a poem I almost always start with when I'm reading from this book because it gets across, I hope, the idea of how disruptive obsessive compulsive disorder can be, even when it's happening very interior, very much in your interior. This is the story of when I was a child and had an obsessive compulsion to draw stars when looking at people's faces. And when I realized other people could tell I was doing it, I stopped, learned how to stop and pull everything even further inside so as not to be detected. The face has seven holes. Someone is talking to you. Look at her face when she's talking to you. Draw a star. Start with the right nostril. Draw a line to the left ear, up to the right eye, down to the mouth, left eye, right ear, left nostril. The face has seven holes. Blink on it. Seven blinks. Her deep black eyes. 1, 2, 3, 4, moving mouth. 5, 6, 7. In gym class, a volleyball hits you in the face. Your eye swells. Is that why you're blinking so much? Someone says. She leans her face in. 7, 14, 21, 28. This behavior is evident. You look like an idiot. 35, 42, 49. Her moving lips. 56, 63. Her face has seven holes. 70. Did she say something? Draw a star. Blink on it. This next poem is called This Is All True, and some of the things in here are related to OCD quite heavily, and some of the things in here are simple, almost childish superstitions that will probably ring true for many of you listening. This is all true. If your foot dangles off the edge of the bed, a metal blade rises from the floor and slices it off. The blade has already been installed in the floor. How do you know you haven't murdered someone accidentally? Look directly at the sun. Touch your eyeball once a day. Bite a hole in your cheek. Run to bed and lie perfectly still beneath the quilt before the toilet stops flushing. Something will happen if you don't. Press your fingers to your palm in a particular order. Don't blink while looking at something upsetting like knives or illness or graves. Blinking 7 times memorizes the faces of the people you love. This knock on the door is the police coming to take you away. Everything can be taken away in a blink. This could be your last day of freedom. And then I'll just read one more for now called Seven Darknesses. There's a lot of repetition of the number 7, the number 4, patterns, counting throughout this collection. And this poem is about the number 7 and OCD, but it's also about a general sense of depression and darkness. 7 Darknesses. No one knows how dark the darkness is. A bat flaps from the hay barn, dressed in a shawl of webs. Call to the night. It answers with a thud against the neighbor's house. It screams like a fox at the gate. The black spots on your heart grow blacker. You might never cast off your darknesses. One trots beside you like a black hole on a leash, barking. No one was meant to live at absolute zero, absolute dark. The earth itself cannot imagine it. Its oceans are strung with lanternfish like fairy lights. Tonight, this spongy cloud blotting copies of the moon across the sky. The warmth of your body emits a single photon, detectable by the most sensitive machinery, and then another, and then this fog slipping into your pocket like a ghostly hand, seeking comfort. And Sarah, would you read to us from the familiar?
Thank you. Also, I love that last poem so much. Yeah, and we can talk about this in a minute, but one of the things that I know that helped me gravitate to you and your poetry when we first met in London was uh, the quality of your imagery and those nightmare images that appear but feel so accurate, right? Like they surprise me, but they also like surprise me. And then I feel like, oh yeah, but that fits, that tracks, right? Like that's the right way to think about A, or like that's the way I see B if I really sit down and think about it, you know. I think you have such a knack for that. Um, but yeah, and we'll go back to that because I want to talk about more more
Thank
of
you.
your imagery and like the um that nightmarish quality. So my book, if I talk about its structure, it's in 5 parts. And as I was writing it, I knew after the first few poems that I was telling like a long story with these two characters that were battling each other. And the first 2 sections of the book, they're kind of like the reader is getting to know these two crazy ladies. And then in the third section, the extraordinary self convinces the husband that they should sneak away to Italy, but the ordinary self, like, is a stowaway in their luggage. And so all three of them end up in Italy, which is, again, weird and unusual. This takes place at the airport. It's called My Heart, Not Hers, and Not Hers Either. If not for Buffalo Wild Wings and their extra large beers, my husband might have divorced my extraordinary self right at the airport. A man traveling with the least wise version of his wife needs a drink, or two, or three, because she will test all of his versions. Perhaps this is where we acknowledge this conceit is not unique, nay, not extraordinary. We all house within our skin and brains another self or two, whole persons devoted to one aspect of 21st century life with particular, not entirely healthy focus. Because I fought to maintain my own shit show of personalities, I'm not sure which version of my husband sat with that version of myself at the airport bar, eating fried whatever. All I know is that on the plane, afterward, separated from him by rows and crammed between two baby boomers who didn't want to share their vacant center seat, my heart burned. Hard indigestion, sure, but with a moment of clarity. It was my heart, not hers, and not hers either. In the scratched chairback TV screen, I saw my reflection, its schism more raw and obvious than ever. Why had I brought us here? Outside, the black tarmac winked its lights as the jet roared. Seatbelt signs sang their warnings. Trailing tissue with her shoe, my extraordinary self returned crying from the bathroom. The stewards tried to soothe her with another drink, a different seat. Several rows behind, my husband settled with relief, grateful for this brief respite from all of me. And then we took off. And this is called Useless Masks. What we don't realize at first is that my ordinary self has accompanied us like a stowaway moth, but more ominous, less pretty. First, let's say it, my poor husband, 3 wives. Next, let's acknowledge how lucky she is, my ordinary self, having become thin and malleable as a scarf, folding like silk into our carry-on, since the Italians lost my extraordinary self's luggage in Rome. She could have been in her own dark exile for days, motion sick from the constant circle and drop of conveyor belts and jet fuel's overly present perfume. But she's here, albeit in secret, kind of, like an elf or fairy who appears at night to pick underwear up off the floor. She's not entirely sure why she came. She dislikes change, standing in lines, sleeping in strange beds, the lack of Wi-Fi. She misses the children, but she likes the Italians with their clarity of voice and vision. What their mouths don't shape, they say with their hands and arms. So different from the way we are, every conversation, a static of false starts, our arms strapped across our chests in like life vests, hands cupped at our lips in useless masks. This weird plane, my fucked up collection of selves, loses pressure by the second, moves faster toward the ground. And one last one. An absurd lament. My ordinary self does what other ordinary persons do abroad, take photos and buy things. Here she finds her people, whole crowds pointing cameras and sifting euros through their fingers like beads of Murano glass. Because she is my ordinary self, even impulsive getaways feature list after list. Family who need souvenirs, foods to try, duomos and basilicas and Gothic arches to stand under, open-mouthed. Check, check, check. But the green waters of Venice, the boutique shops of off San Marco Plaza, none of it translates well to film or looks as authentic under the hotel lamp's glare. By the time we arrive in Sicily, she's begun to understand why most ordinary people stay home. There are only so many Italian cat t-shirts one can buy. Customs will only allow so many anchovy-wrapped almonds past their gates. She won't admit it to any of us, but she misses her ordinary diet and her ordinary views. We can tell by the way she picks at her pastry in the morning how, when we visit the Temple of Venus, she's more impressed by stray dogs and lisping toddlers than the centuries-old stonework beneath her feet. She sees the white caps cresting the Mediterranean and, true story, she misses the Atlantic. By the week's end, we can read her only as pathetic, myopic in her vision's scope. She regrets her attempt to escape, to be anything other than unremarkable and content. She spends those last nights folding and refolding clothes into the suitcase next to the trinkets she bought. She rehearses leaving as if spontaneity were a specter to guard against, her humming an absurd lament. So thanks for listening to that. And I think like that speaks to the structure. Like I would write one poem and then I would necessitate like, okay, so the characters are doing this. Like how will they react now as they move through these different places? And but when I did get to the end of the Italian section, where the trip is a failure, nobody gets what they want, I was kind of like, well, what do I do with them now? I had a moment which I suppose fiction writers like novelists have where they go, okay, I don't know what to do with my characters. But I really had to sit with that for a little bit and think like, okay, so where does the narrative move? Like, where does it go? And ultimately I was like, well, one of them has to go. One of them's got to die. So then I had them like battling to like kill off the extraordinary self in the next section, which was fun, a lot of fun for a while. But then there were like only so many poems you could write about that too. And I was like, well, what happens now? Right. And that I had to sit with that for a little bit, which I think is not something that often poets do when they're creating collections, is thinking about like events, you know?
Mm-hmm.
But that's the structure of the book, and that's how I came to it. Luckily I finally like wrapped it up at
And
the
don't
end.
tell us what happens in the end, because I
Okay.
do feel like you have to read this book from beginning to end. I can't imagine what someone would think if they picked up a poem two-thirds of the way through your book, The Familiar, and actually, what would they think was going on?
I
Like,
know.
so it's so interesting how, if you create a book like this that's meant to be read from beginning to end, from front to back, like you can't always control the way the reader picks up your book and starts reading it, though. Like, are they going to know that you need to read it that way?
Yeah. I mean, I tried to have as many of the poems as I could like work on their own,
Mhm.
like that trying to, if someone would be like patient enough to be like, okay, I'm gonna suspend my disbelief for a moment and just kind of go for the ride until the end of the poem. And I hope that they would hang on. And I think they kind of worked that way, individually, because a couple times like the poems were picked up singly, but
Oh, they absolutely do. Yeah. More than a couple times.
well,
They have appeared in journals. Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely.
Um, so if we go back to thinking about the nightmarish imagery thing, because I said I wanted to return to it. I was really thinking about you know, that it came most alive for me in Paper Doll Fetus. Like that's probably my favorite still of, well, actually, but I mean, except for Exploding Head is like also up in my favorites, but like those, that's where the imagery like really, I felt like it was like you were coming home, like that you were hitting your stride in that book. But elements of it appeared in Sightseer. And I mean, and it was in your poems before you were collecting like books, or poems for a book. The first poems that I read in London, they all had some of those poems. And I guess some of those poems from London ended up in your first book or close to it. Um, Maybe it was just that
Probably. There is,
experiences in that travel ended up in Sightseer.
including you, Sarah, there's a poem in Wales. Yeah, with you in. And we should have included when we were on a trip together in our tire blew, our brand new tire blew on the road in Wales, and we fixed it together by the side of the road. But yeah, you're in that book too. I love that. I love that you're in my book. And you're secretly in Exploding Head too. I've told you where, but I won't tell
All right.
anyone else where. Yep, that's what happens when you're friends with someone for however many years it's been. I can't even calculate. 25 years,
Let's
30
not
years. Let's
have a
not.
heart attack.
Yeah. Well, I think oh gosh, imagery. I wonder how much of imagery is tied to OCD also, because the way that I primarily experience obsessive compulsive disorder is with intrusive. I wouldn't even, we say intrusive thoughts, but I wouldn't even say they're thoughts. They're like movies playing in my mind. Like, I don't think, what if the plane crashes? I just immediately see the plane crash and all the violent detail. And so that's something that I experienced since I was very, very little. Seeing things so clearly and not things I wanted to see necessarily, and not things that were in my control to see. And so thinking about control, that's actually interesting because once you start writing, you have control over what you show your reader, what you bring into the poem. And although I wasn't ever bringing in explicitly OCD into my poems until recently, I think that imagery, violent imagery, scary imagery, probably worked its way in throughout all my collections and all my work because that's how I see the world, fortunately or unfortunately. And there's a lot of beauty that can be made out of, scary, nightmarish, fierce imagery. You really just have to be brave and go with it. So I think that that's sort of a quality of my poetry that I didn't try to create. It just is a part of me writing from myself. Um, Oh, so this is Paper Doll Fetus. This is my second collection that you were talking about. Um, I don't read from it very often, but I'll read one poem from
Yeah.
it. Um, so I'll just read kind of the title-ish poem. I don't know how crazy the imagery is, but it's basically working off the concept of a paper doll fetus, which is when there are twins in the womb and one of them dies, becomes no longer viable, and is small enough for the viable fetus to grow in the womb and flatten the remaining tissues of the non-viable fetus against the wall of the womb, and it becomes like paper. So this is the paper doll fetus speaking to the twin who survived. The paper doll fetus speaks to the viable twin in utero. Days, a week, or 2 weeks passed before I discerned I was dying, and the things which were to be my eyes shriveled up like pricked balloons. It is always night in here, I cannot know if it is you, though something is wringing out my heart, what was to be my heart, my tongue, my skin is being ground to a pulp. There was not enough time to rehearse a graceful pose before I was wedged against the wall. I am splayed like a weather vane. Your head is enormous. When did it happen that I am no bigger than your footprint? I am becoming a scrap of parchment on which is scrawled my flattened, waxy face. Unfold me. You will find a tiny skeleton stirred into the paper. I am a letter to you, and it says, if you held me up to the wind, I will flutter away. At times in the future, you will feel that something has been lost, but you will not remember what it is. No one understands why this is happening. Look at me. You know me better than anyone. I am not angry. Um, okay, Sarah, so while we're on the topic of what we like about each other's poetry, which I could go on and on, um, I what I love specifically, and it's not just your most recent book, it's your first collection too. I love how you're able to write about yourself, but a fictionalized self. And I think we talk about this so much in poetry. The speaker's not really me, but you take it to the next level. In fabulist narrative, you're actually creating another world in which you also exist. You know, it's almost like creating an avatar with these multiple selves who are kind of warring it out in the familiar. So it's something I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about, like how that came to be, how you created these worlds and alternate versions of the self. Is that something that you needed to do, or that it help you unlock something that you couldn't have said otherwise?
Yes, the latter. It's
Mm.
the unlocking the thing that you couldn't have otherwise. I know that with my first book, um, the fable part is all about this shape-shifting pig, and the sow um, has this magic quality to her, and I that was a prompt I gave myself as a way back into writing when I had not been writing for what felt like years after grad school, and I had just had a baby, or maybe it was the second baby, and I was basically, I felt like uninspired. I had been writing like kind of confessional first person poems, and I was tired of them. I was tired of like myself, and I was like, but I was also a poet, and I was like, but I'm gonna write narrative poems. I'm gonna write a poem about uh a character that is so far removed from myself that I'll feel comfortable, because it won't be confessional then, right? And then I'm like, and then I'm gonna give it magic powers. It was like, will it fly? I was like, no, it's gonna shift shape. And then I can have a lot of fun with that. Like it can become like lots of different things. And but of course through that, then I realized I was writing about myself and motherhood by the time I got to the end of the series. But like that kind of set the stage for like the second book when I had these characters. I was already aware of what I was doing, that like I was writing about difficulty I was having with midlife and coming to the point where I felt like I had sacrificed a ton at work, and I had very little to show for it. I felt like by that point, when I started writing the second book, the first book had not been published. It hadn't been picked up. It had been rejected like 143 times, I think. I sent it out everywhere, and it was just never getting paid. It had been finalist, which had kept me like sending it to places. I was encouraged enough to like keep giving them my monies, but
I just
like,
want to say solidarity on this point too. Sarah, you're not the only one. And you know, I
yeah,
sent out my first book for 7 years. And it
yeah.
was, it's a tough road. And I'm so glad that you stuck with it.
Oh, well, thanks. Me too. I'm glad you are too. I mean, I was very close to giving up, and I was like at this point where I'm like, I just want to have fun with my writing. And so that's kind of how the familiar came again, because I wanted to stop taking myself so seriously. And I wanted to also, to some extent, it's not take the work itself less seriously, but also maybe like being less precious about the poems. And so that's why I like started throwing in like pop culture references and slang and obscenities here and there. I wanted it to sound like my voice and like my person. And so that, um, but also I think through the publishing of the first book, I had also, someone had called me a fabulist. I was published, I got poems from that first book published in, um, uh, you know, journals that were specific to fabulism, and it was kind of like a discovery for me, and then to begin thinking about myself in like that particular genre, like, okay, I'm a fabulist poet, like, and maybe I won't always be, but I it kind of gave me a home for a while.
Well, it's kind of like the experience I had going to my MFA and having people say, "Oh, you write like this other author that I had never heard of." And then that opened up another world for me. Like, oh, it's kind of reflecting your own possibilities, or maybe even opening a door that you were already stepping through.
Yeah.
And someone was, "Hey, did you know that this other world exists outside this door?"
Yeah.
Um, I know, can you read us something else from your fabulous history?
Oh, maybe, one more, maybe I'll do one from this, from Fabulous
Yeah,
Beast.
that'd be great.
Um,
Tell us what Fabulous Beast is though. Like I think
so Fabulous Beast, I mean it's like the chimera, like that's another word for the chimera, which is, again, like another kind of shapeshifter. And the second, so the first part is fable, the fairy tale is the woman with the frog tongue. And actually, yeah, it's that was a narrative poem, and like those poems were definitely really hard to like publish individually in other journals, because they're so like one chapter necessitates what happens in the next chapter necessitates what happened, and like so it was harder for somebody to pick up, I suppose. um but in And then the third section explored myth, and like, but all of those, like the myth, the fairy tale, the fable, was all kind of like examining motherhood, voice, like as one comes into adulthood, and autonomy, and issues of like knowing who you are in the world, identity. um so this is Why Our Mothers Never Age, from the fable section. The sow cannot count her years by litters or seasons, nor her days by sunsets or the shadows crawl across the sky. The timer inside her runs down heartbeats, not minutes, and keeps her inhalation steady, moves her heavy limbs to rise at dawn and receive the farmer's call. She has always been this age, walking from pen to field and back without hesitation or regret, because an animal kept by routine rarely pauses from fear or sorrow. Each day begins gray and rendered by broad strokes the color of uncooked fat, then shrinks and solidifies with the day's heat. The long hash marks on the fence rail are not a catalog of days, but mark a rare freak occurrence, the moment and the place where her teeth could not or would not break through. So some of the poems, I actually have the sow like speaking to her young. In other poems, like she is very much the sow. Sometimes she changes into the farmer's wife, who is passed. Like she takes the shape and the form of the farmer's dead wife, um, and like plays at like human mothering as opposed to like the sow mothering. And so I was exploring that too, like the choices that like a female mother might have versus the animal mother, the similarities between the two, like this biological um necessity, that occurs in both kinds of mothering. um yeah, and the sameness and the attendant exhaustion with both.
hmm hmm
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really not only are you dealing with narrative, creating a world and storytelling in your poems, but you're also working in persona, sort of in a way. um,
Well,
taking
just like
on a
you
different
do.
speak. Yeah, I do. Yeah, in Paper Doll, you're right. In Paper Doll Fetus, most of those poems are persona poems.
Yeah.
And I love the idea. Like, there's one in which I'm the voice of a stone in a field, and and also giving voice to things and beings that can't speak. Like you kind of avoid the issue of, well, why isn't that, why are you writing in the persona of someone
Right.
else who can speak? Well, a stone in a field doesn't have a voice, so I can occupy it in any way I wish. There's so much freedom there. And especially when you're thinking of, an unborn fetus from the 1500s that someone wrote about in a book that I read about, there's so much freedom in taking on persona in that form. I
Mhm.
think, yeah, it is about yourself, even though you're writing um, from a different perspective. Like you said, it unlocks something.
Yeah. I think you can, when you're, and it transferred to like the other characters too in the book. Like there's the family
Mm.
that's in the familiar, and so there's the husband character, there's the children that are mentioned briefly. Like I, they're I have children, I have a husband, but they are like the people in the book are fictional, and they can't be like actually my husband because I'm not really recording his experience. So I was trying to be careful about that too, like not necessarily take like try to adopt their perspective. Um, but instead like maybe just acknowledge like the stress that the speaker, I suppose, like if there's the extraordinary self and the ordinary self, there's like this distanced speaker who's like the whole self, I guess. I haven't given her a name yet, but she's watching things and she's like acknowledging that like this is really rough for the other members of the family. Like
Mhm.
so I could go that far, I felt,
Mhm.
instead of like adopting like even more personas. But I felt like in the paper doll fetus that was really necessary, like giving that voice to all those different objects and um you know mishaps.
Mhm.
Like I mean, uh the protocol speaks to the mermaid baby is a poem that I still like bring to my creative writing classes and have them read, and we talk about persona and
Mm.
what's going on and like how you have to suspend disbelief to read the poem. And I think um that helps too for them to realize that like they can do more with their poems than simply like throw up on the page kind of thing. Which, I mean, can be very
Yeah.
cathartic, and I enjoy it myself occasionally. But like that, they can begin taking those feelings and doing something like really, like engage themselves with,
Mm.
you know,
Mhm.
that
Yeah,
character.
it is almost like I love how earlier you mentioned that you had kind of given yourself a prompt as well. I think part of that is what works for me when I think of persona poems. And like when you think of a protocol speaking to a mermaid baby, so the protocol is the the list of things you're supposed to do when a fetus is forming with legs that are fused. And so a protocol doesn't speak. A protocol is not even a living being. So, like a stone in a field, a protocol is like a concept. So um, it really forces you to step outside what you think you're doing to occupy a different voice and a different perspective that you wouldn't have gotten to. I thought it was also interesting how you talked about your trajectory and how perhaps you will not always be a fabulist poet. We'll see what happens with the next
Yeah.
project. And I think about my trajectory as being research, 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 and then my final, most recent book, Exploding Head. I had to really tell myself, resist the research. You are writing about the self for once. These are not persona poems. These are self poems about me. I am the speaker, and yet all of them are in the second person. They all say you. So
Yeah.
there are always these ways that we find, I think, in poetry to get closer to ourselves and find our truths through distancing.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that second person voice, I've done that quite a lot, where you speak it or remove to yourself. And I mean, that's probably why it was an easy jump for me to then like create the characters. Um, and I don't know. I mean, like there are parts of the fabulism, like I don't know. I know that like I'm writing this first play and I've been writing it for like 10 years and it's probably never going to be finished. But in its current iteration, like I mean, I have this post-it note, it just says like make it weird. And, like it's my reminder like that I want to startle, right? And I want to to poke at the imaginations of others, like with my own weird imagery. And so because I think that that part can still be engaging. So like it might end up being like a fabulist play. I don't know. But like I like the idea of um trying to make the impossible seem possible on paper.
Mm. I want to transition because I think we have like 13 minutes
Time.
left before
Yeah.
we should start asking questions. We have so much we want to talk about, but you were really talking about something you are not only already good at doing in your poems, making it weird, but something you're also good at teaching. And I know that because we have taught a class together on making it strange.
Right.
And I think we should probably talk a bit about our partnership over the past year. Our most recent books came out just about the same time, early 2024. So it's been a year, a little bit more than a year. And we did so many events together and pitched readings together, taught a class, did a panel presentation, did a book fair. I don't know what else.
I know.
I tried assembling. I looked back through pictures on my phone today, and it was a
That was
big, fun year. And I have constantly with all my friends sung your praises of how contagious your so two things happened to me during last year which were different for my fourth book than any other book. One is you, which we'll get to in a second because we're going to talk, and the other one is that I hired a publicist, which I had never done before. I had done very limited. Have never gone on a book tour. I did very limited events for my previous books. And a lot of that was that I was in a different place in my life. My child is now a teenager, and it's much easier to leave a teen at home than it was when my first book came out. And I had a 1 year old at home, a 6 month old, when I learned that I had won the first book prize. So the timing is right now. Um, and the publicist offered me really a cheerleading section. I worked with Cassie at Pine State Publicity, and she was just psyched about my book. And that infectious energy is really contagious. And believing in yourself is so important when you're reaching out and trying to get attention for your book. For me, it was really important this time because I wanted to find readers. And it wasn't about book sales, it was about connecting with people who have OCD stories of their own, and also others who don't know much about OCD who would benefit from hearing my story. So this book felt very important. Um, but then the second magical thing that happened was that I got all wrapped up in Sarah's book tour excitement. And you had kind of a mantra that I loved and wrote down, which was to honor your work and remind yourself that you have put so much time and energy into this book, and we're going to go out and celebrate. It's not icky, salesy. It's genuine, positive celebration and connecting with readers. Um, so officially, thank you, Sarah. I was not going to do 90% of the readings and events that I did, but we pitched things together, and having that really made a big difference.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you want to, I feel like I was able to benefit from your gung-ho attitude. And I think probably just if you want to share with us some of the things that like some of your perspective that you've shared with me over the past year, and some of the things that you think we did that worked really well or maybe didn't work well.
Hmm. Well, I know that like when we were because you had had the four books already, like or three books and then this was your fourth and you really wanted to have, especially like this was your first like very personal book, right? And I felt like um you were less sure of yourself going in. You really needed someone to be like, no, you absolutely have to do these things. Like that this book and so I'm so grateful that you did have Cassie because she has like the connections that I don't, but I at least was able to like give you that cheerleading that like kept you going. And it felt like a lot less. So the things I would say for honoring your work is like to have some fun with the publicity stuff if you can, instead of like just feeling cringy about it. Like I made ridiculous little like Canva things like with when I got blurbs for the book, and I used this app called the Glitchy app, and it's like you can distort photos in lots of different ways. And so I made like lots of different weird glitched photos of like my of selfies and things, and
Can you
then
please open up your book and show us one? Because
oh
the
yeah.
Familiar has color
I
section
know. Well, that's really
dividers.
cool. I cannot
It's
believe
really
that they
cool
sprang for it, but
that you created.
yeah. So I gave it to them for like cut ideas
Oh,
for cover
yeah.
images. Like, oh, sorry, that's the what, green screen or whatever. But yeah, they start off the sections. So like it's like pixelated and warped, and you can choose like the kind of filters that are warping and pixelating your images. But like I just had fun, like it was being creative in a different kind of way. Um I started like I did a couple little book trailers. I asked friends of mine, and they weren't all poets. Like there were at least three people who were, no, four. Maybe they were all just friends who were not writers, but I had them read my poems, and I made like little videos for them out of images. And so like and then I'd throw it up on Instagram. Like it was just fun to like do those kinds of things. And I don't know how much like that helped, get an awareness of my book, but it like gave me like this. I was like, oh, look, I made this thing, and I'd share it with people, and people would like at least, like get the little serotonin jump with like the likes in my Instagram thing. But it it gave me like a sense of purpose that made me feel like I was doing something productive. I don't know how productive it actually was, but it had the illusion of productivity. And I felt like I was doing something to honor my work. And then it was definitely a lot easier for us, I think, to um, get picked up by different reading series in different places when we were like two people together saying like, yes, we would like to bring our show to you, which again, like that sounds icky, right? Like a traveling poet, show. But like we basically said, you can have at least two readers, and we tried to again like go to places where we knew someone, so that like we would even ask, if we could read with one of our, local friends. And um those those were really good experiences. I mean, I also got to, participate. I got to look at my book from the perspective of like um how it addresses mental health, which like at first I had really hadn't thought about up until you had an opening, someone you were supposed to speak with at the Rivers and Ridges Festival in Wisconsin. They like backed out, and so you needed another speaker. And I came in and I wrote a paper, and I began to see like how much the familiar, I call it a book about existential crisis, but it really is like also my anxiety and my depression writ large, and so that was like helpful too. Like some of the events then prompted me to think about my work in a different way. I don't know, did you hit any of those kinds of moments yourself?
Yeah, and I did see Rebecca also just dropped a link in the chat that was published. You actually turned that panel presentation into an essay that was published at Write or Die. So people can go read that. It's fantastic. I think that just writing the essays around, but then also the fun stuff you talked about, like creating images, playing around in Canva, it's a way of staying, for me at least, connected with the work. Because oftentimes what happens is you get a book accepted for publication, and then a year and a half goes by, and then it comes out, and you're already working on something else. And, by the time you're promoting a book and, doing readings from a book, it's been 2 years since you thought about that book. So for me, I really focused on reconnecting with the work through writing essays. And I was writing essays for the purpose of trying to land them in publications, timed along with the publication of the book. And that is one of the primary reasons I engaged a publicist, because that was not something I was capable of doing on my own. I was heavily writing essays the year before the book was published, and I had a bunch ready to go, and I realized I really needed some help. I needed someone to knock on the door for me, someone with a connection with editors to just get them looked at. And also Cassie was fantastic. She has a creative nonfiction background, and she helped me re-envision, not just revise, but revision my some of my essays. So I always tell her it was sort of like a mini MFA in creative nonfiction. So it was worth the money from her expertise on writing essays. That's something I will always have going forward, regardless of, again, book sales. It really benefited me because I was reconnecting with the purpose of my book, like honoring my work. Why had I written a book about OCD anyway in the first place? You know, what did I want to share? So it helped keep me engaged in those questions throughout the publicity phase of the book, like when the book is out and I'm sharing it with people. Um, yeah, so that was really beneficial to me on a personal level. And
Yeah.
we were not invited to do readings also. We pitched.
Oh yeah.
And Sarah set up, we had a joint Google Drive. We had all of our press kit materials in there.
We are
Sarah
girls who
created
love a spreadsheet.
We love a spreadsheet. We had many Zoom calls. I just can't, understate the value of, if you can, finding like a poetry support person. I mean, we were really able to combine forces, and we already know each other. We have a very long history of writing and living together, and we know each other's work. But just the fact that we were willing to connect and work with each other on pitching readings jointly really helped, on both a success level and on an emotional level. It was very important for me to be able to feel supported that way. Um, and it is easier to get a reading as well if you can pitch kind of a theme. We found how our work connected, how our books speak to each other, and we are also from different areas. I'm from Madison, Wisconsin, and you're from Long Island. So like we don't have the same friends really. Like we really can join forces and bring new audiences to each other, just through the genuine act of sharing our work.
Right. And I mean, I also think like through this too, like um how many other authors I came into contact with that I, hadn't had the chance to meet before or whose work I was unfamiliar with, but then I was introduced to, like, and that felt really, it expanded like my poetry community, which was a really cool aspect of it.
I
And
mhm.
oh, go ahead.
I am the most introverted person. And I'm really shy. I mean, you're laughing, but like, you know me. And it's really hard for me to get out there. It's so hard. I'm one of those like extroverted introverts, when I need to be extroverted. I love it. When I'm comfortable with people, I love it. So having had a friend connecting with me to do readings with has allowed me to be more outgoing and to really go out there and meet people. And I almost feel like I didn't have a connection to the literary community, which is another reason I hired a publicist and another reason I decided, hey, I better get out there this time and do a few more readings. Because I work outside of academia. I have been at the same job for 18 years, in the electrical engineering and utility field. It's nothing that's going to help me connect with other poets and writers. So I do feel that after this past year, I have found so many amazing friends. I've made real meaningful connections. I almost have too many friends. I mean, that I feel so full, and grateful over what has come from this past year. So, um, one last thing that I would say, just in conclusion for myself before we move to questions, is just that for me, it wasn't about book sales or numbers or getting on any kind of list. Um, I don't even really follow book sales. I don't know what my book sales are, honestly, which is maybe a terrible thing to say, but it really for me was and continues to be about making those meaningful, genuine connections. And that is something that happened because of are connecting on social media, doing events like this, and getting out there and doing readings.
Yeah, I think like it helped. I might add that doing you can say honor the work, but also it is helpful to have like a non-monetary goal, or like a non-book sale kind of goal for like doing something like a book tour. Because also, like, I mean, I spent a ton of money that, like, my family had to, like it took from my family so that I could go travel and do things. Like, I made, ridiculous book swag and stuff. And like that's like from a place of privilege too, because I had my job and I was able to afford like some of those things. Not all of them, but most of them. And then like, but I came across like what I really wanted to do. I've been teaching at a community college for like 20 years, and only occasionally I get to teach at like a four-year university or other places, besides with people who are like, because most of the time I'm teaching intro to creative writing or I'm teaching like freshman comp, and like that becomes a slog. And I wanted to teach like a greater variety of classes. And so my idea too with doing travel and trying to justify it, and all the going out and meeting people is that like perhaps it'll lead to like some teaching opportunities that'll just like make because I'm not going to leave the community college. I like my students. I like the work to an extent. Like I just want something that makes it feel a little more edifying and like, so that was one of my goals. Like it might pan out. I don't know. There's no like, return on investment that I can like
Mm-hmm.
talk of yet, but like that was just one of my hopes. And it was something that like made me feel better about going out there and saying, hey, I have this new book. And hey, I also teach. And hey, let me come teach. um,
Absolutely. Everyone's going to have a different goal for their book tour, and the money situation is real.
yeah, yeah.
So I appreciate your adding that perspective. Thank you so much. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, I'm happy to jump in because we have a few questions that have come in from the
Wonderful.
audience. Let's start with Laurel had a question, two separate questions, so one for each of you. So the first one is for Sarah. The first person speaker has two other versions you call characters. How is it different than fantasy, or at least for me, feels like a different genre? Because I think of persona in a different way, or maybe you see this as persona or not. If you could talk to a little bit about that.
I guess that's a good question because I was not I almost didn't notice that there was like the third character, like this I voice looking until I think Cynthia said something about it. And then she was one of my early readers. And I was like, oh yeah, like there is this like third kind of self. And I think the thing that I like about Fabulous, so like I actually loved fantasy when I was younger, and like, I think I was like 13 and I wrote like a little novella, like fantasy novella. It was terrible. I think it's burned. I hope it's burned somewhere. But like I've always loved that, right? And so then when I was getting like into these poems that were weird and adopting characters, and the characters were kind of like magical, like that. Then I realized, like, I just realized it was more of this thing, like the world looks a lot like our world, but then there are these little elements of fantasy, and that's really like a lot of fabulist writing is like that. I mean, it's magical realism, but not because that's very centered around like a particular place and culture. So, but it's akin to it, fabulism. I would say like you're more or less in the real world, but then there are these like inexplainable uh magical moments that occur. And so like the splitting of the selves and having them like war with one another, like, and having the third self like just stand back and be like, what is happening? Like that was made possible through like understanding that like I could write poetry that was fiction. And that was kind of freeing.
Mhm. Awesome, thank you. And then I guess to kind of shift to Cynthia, how narrow does the focus need to be for you in the project book in order to contain it?
Mhm.
Like, how do you zoom in to figure out what that focus is going to be?
Oh my gosh, this is such a big question. It's hard to answer. I'm trying to think of what are my rules. I think for my first collection, it was travel poems. And initially I had all these other rules that I had put on sites here, which were that every poem had to be in couplets, and every poem was a letter to something. Every poem was dear something something. And a lot of them still are, like Dear Pigeons, Poland, dear Athassel Abbey Priory, and I have like dear places, and I'm speaking to something that I saw when I was traveling. And then I kind of realized through the process of submitting, getting more feedback, that not every poem has to be exactly the same in order for it to sit together, that some poems might be served better by stygic forms or differently numbered stanzas rather than entirely couplets, because that was a rule that I had put on my poems because I wanted them all to be the same. And
Mm,
so it was really a way of thinking through what makes something cohere. Is it form? Is it topic? Is it, and it could be any of these things. And then also not just thinking about what makes something stick together or how narrowly can I define this for a book that I'm writing from my perspective, but how boring or how interesting is it going to be for the reader,
mhm.
from the reader's perspective encountering this? And I've done a lot of thinking about project books. I, for a while, was hosting a website that is still available online called The Cloudy House. And it is a series of interviews with other authors who have written project books.
Oh, nice.
We have about 50 or so interviews that are still there. And I was doing that with Nick Lance. We're not hosting new interviews anymore, but if you're interested in checking it out, some of those interviews are really fascinating. And they're all talking about how they define a project and how they keep themselves interested and readers interested through the process of building a book that way.
That is really really cool. Thank you for that resource. And then I think I have two more questions. One is from Jason, and he asks, "Who gets to read your first drafts? How kind or honest do you like those readers to be?" Either.
Go ahead, Cynthia.
Um, so wow, over the years, over the years, it's been changing different people. I usually share them with poetry peers who would be Sarah, or for example, poetry groups. I've often only written because I had a deadline for a poetry group. And so those would be peers that are sitting around a table in my dining room, or peers who are now, we do it on Zoom. So we can include people like Nick Lance, for example, who moved from Wisconsin to Texas. And now we're back in a poetry group together. And Sarah, who I meet with on Zoom to share. So those groups are really critiquing our work. And I think that I want them to be as, I forget what the word was. Was it real or mean or what was the word?
No, it's honest or
Honest.
yeah,
It's very interesting that the word that was actually used was honest, but I thought mean.
yeah.
So I want them to be 100% honest, but I think the reason my mind went to mean was because especially when you have a long-standing relationship with a poetry peer, especially someone who's a friend, I think it can be hard to be fully honest because you're trying not to seem mean. Like sometimes I worry that my poetry peers are too kind to me and maybe are not mean/honest enough. But I trust them. And I really don't think I've ever published a poem or an essay or anything that I haven't run through at least one poetry group or multiple poetry groups. I'm dependent.
I have a poetry group that I didn't have any kind of poetry group for a very long time. But then the pandemic happened and I had one of my friends from grad school reached out and he said that he and a couple of other people were in this like Zoom poetry group that met on Saturdays and would I like to join, and I was thrilled, and like it was nice to reconnect with them because I hadn't seen many of them in over a decade. Um and but I would like say, for if you haven't had the MFA experience, and you are looking for poetry peers to kind of form a group with, that would form, that would give you good feedback, I would say go to open mics. You're going to hear a lot of like bad stuff from people who aren't interested in getting critique. um, but you're going to also like eventually you're going to hear somebody, you're going to be like, oh, they're my person. Like that's someone whose work I really love. I would like to know more about them. And like, cause that's how Cynthia and I found each other, like was, well, technically like I replaced her at a job in London. We were both on student work visas, but like through our conversation as she was like training me to take over her spot, like we realized that we both wrote poems, and we found the poetry cafe in London, and through that we like realized that we liked one another's work, and so we started exchanging. We've done that for years now. So I really think like you have to go, especially if you're an introvert, which a lot of poets are, you got to put yourself out there a little bit, maybe go to some open mics and really search for the people whose work speaks to you, and then like ask them out on a poetry date, be like, would you like to meet and exchange work? And then eventually like they might have a person that they trust and whose work you like to, and you can form like a triad, and then you can like welcome more people in. But I think that's the way to kind of do it. Or like now in this age of like technology, if you know somebody um through social media and you've seen some of their work and you'd like to work with them, like just reach out and say like, do you want to do a Zoom session? Like if you I mean, that's I've met some really good poetry friends since the pandemic, like on Instagram and in these Zoom kind of places. It's
I,
been really rewarding.
I just want to add a couple things.
Yeah.
I want to second your plug for open mics. And I also want to say that I really enjoyed revisiting our reading, the way in which we read, having done so many events together over the past year, because we, I think, learned to read in those poetry open mics in London. And again, when we moved back to the States, and we were both actually from the same area, and we had that reading series in Arlington, Virginia, where we read, and you had a strict 2-minute time limit, and he would cut you off. And we learned how to read, how to present. We read every month at the open mic. And then I also want to say, as far as sharing work with people, and very early on in the conversation, I was thinking about influence and inspiration. And recently, a few months ago, I was taking some files off a very old computer and had found a bunch of stuff that Sarah didn't necessarily have anymore that she had written, where we were writing poems back and forth with each other. And we didn't necessarily put our names at the top of the Word docs. And some of them I couldn't figure out if I had written them or Sarah had written them. So it's really interesting how I mean, I think in a good way. There were lots of ways in which we were exploring kind of the same similar territory. So it's been a fun and really rewarding relationship.
That's wonderful. We have one last question from Wendy, who just wanted to know, because I think this is a question that so many people have. I would love to know how Cynthia and Sarah fit poetry writing into their busy lives. And I think that is a question that comes up again and again, and we all want to know the you know the way forward.
Well, if you guys can tell me,
Yeah.
I mean, I like it's changed too. Like I used to get up really early and write, and sometimes I find it really impossible to get up really early and write now. So, um, having the poetry groups does help. Like Cynthia mentioned, like, oh, I have groups, so I have a deadline and I need a poem. We have like this pop-up poetry group that started recently, and like that has helped motivate me to like get something written for the group. And um yeah, so I think like routine is helpful. Even if like you have to put it at the beginning or the end of the day, but just like making yourself sit there. And there are times where like I try not to waste too much time, but if I spend like say a good 5 minutes staring at the page and I get like very little down, I immediately turn to reading and I just go and I read something and I take notes on it. And I do that. And then eventually I just trust that like the next day or the next day after that, like I'm gonna eventually just something will hit and then I'll keep going. But um it's you gotta cram it wherever you can cram it. That is my very eloquent answer.
I totally agree with cramming it wherever you can cram it. That's kind of my philosophy as well, and how I've been writing over the years. I think that for me, it's been very hard to have a scheduled writing time. I've tried writing in the mornings. I've tried writing at night. I can't write at a particular time. I write when I can write and I'm feeling like I can do it, but I don't wait for the muse. I sit down and do it and make it happen because it's not until I'm already writing that I think then the muse comes, if you believe in the muse at all, which probably I don't, because I do like to write very intentionally from projects perspective and research perspective. And I think that a lot of cramming the writing in has to do with my ability to engage in large scope projects because those are the kinds of things you can slip right back into easily. And so you're not wasting any time sitting down saying, what am I going to write about? You know, I am ready to go. I'm thinking throughout the day of a project that I'm working on. And so all of that writing is happening that's not necessarily on the clock.
Mhm.
So I have, files open all the time. I always have my thumb drive plugged into my work computer, and if I have a note, if I think of something, I write it down and make sure to just capture that. But if you can work on an extended project, you can really multiply the amount of time you have in a day to write, so that you're really writing while you're doing the laundry. You're writing while you're walking the dog. You're writing while you're working, even though you're really working and being productive at your job. You're also kind of thinking and percolating, and all of that counts.
And I will say that I really miss my jobs where I was like a secretary, and like stuffing envelopes because those were the best for writing poetry. Because you're sitting there
You
doing a mundane task that doesn't take any brain power, and you can be sitting there writing poems in your head while you're, doing your actual work. It's a little harder to do that with teaching, because you get their language in your head, but like so that's why like usually early morning or late at night is better for me just because like that's when I have silence.
Great. I think we're essentially out of time. I was going to invite Lisa to join us to say but I can also do it. I want to thank Cynthia and Sarah for their time tonight and for your poems and for your insight. I think someone commented about the talking about book promotion was really helpful and inspiring to think of it as a celebration and something, you know, to look forward to and to make fun again. Um, and we are really grateful for everyone who joined us tonight. And if you enjoyed this event, please follow the Notebooks Collective on our social media accounts and sign up for our newsletter if you haven't already. Lisa's put them all in the chat, so they're all right there. We have a full year of events down the pike, including Cynthia is going to be teaching a class for us, which I'm really excited about. And then I guess before we go, I would love it if we could unmute and get a round of applause for our guests.
Thank you.
And
Thank you so much.
I wanted to thank everyone for coming. And we hope that we will see you again soon.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Night.